friends, welcome back and thank you for joining me today. I am so honored to be here today with Jonathan Van Valin, and he's going to share with us about his near-death experience that he had when he was in his 20s. Here's a little bit about Jonathan. He grew up and lived in Seattle until a series of inner events pointed him towards relinquishing that life in favor of an awakening and radical falling away of egoic self. Those events, of course, included the near-death experience that we're going to learn about today. Jonathan writes, creates videos, and meets with people to help remove blocks to the awareness of our deepest being and live from the peace that pours forth. You can find Jonathan at assistthespirit.com. I will also have his YouTube channel and his Facebook linked in the description. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Would you like to start just by sharing your near-death experience?
Be delighted to. This entire journey, as far as the near-death experience, began some time ago. I was 29 years old, and ultimately, it was the result of a complication from a surgery. The surgery was days in the past. I had been released from the hospital into the watchful care of my father, who I will remember always for many reasons, including this particular act of love on his part. He insisted on hauling me out to the family farmhouse to watch over me as I recovered. And the surgery was for sleep apnea, which is a little unusual for the average 29-year-old, but that was the case, and it's a surgery that was known for being particularly painful in recovery, which ended up playing a lot into the story here. So the bottom line was that I had been released. I'd been in the hospital for about 4 days, and then released into my father's care, and because of the nature of the surgery, where they removed all this tissue from the back of my throat and things like this, and it made it impossible to, or very extremely difficult and extremely painful to do very ordinary things like swallow. And, even just breathing could be, kind of painful. And talking was almost impossible. I could eke out, a whisper at most, that sort of thing. This part of your body is so nerve-rich. The way it was described to me by one of the doctors at the time was that I was going to, unfortunately, be one of those people that knew what it was like to break your leg and then have to walk on it. So it really, that was very accurate. And so all this tissue, nerve-rich tissue is really disrupted. Then you still have to use it. So I think I was in my father's care for 3 or 4 days. And as far as the near-death experience was, well, it was so unexpected. As I spent these couple of days in his care doing next to nothing other than staring out windows. There wasn't much else for me to do. And there came a moment in the middle of a day there when I simply felt an inner click. That's the best way I could possibly describe it. It was just this very, very clear awareness of this inner click. And in that moment, what I could see immediately was that the animating life force in me was beginning to drain away. I didn't yet know why. That would come in a little while. But it was very clear that my body had just begun to die. And there was a couple of recognitions, realizations, revelations that followed immediately upon that awareness of that inner click. The first was, to my sort of quiet astonishment, was that I immediately recognized that I wasn't my body, which was something that I couldn't have conceived of until that moment. What I mean by that is that what I recognized was that the body was dying, but that there was a consciousness, being, some aspect of my beingness that was observing the fact that my body was dying, and that observing consciousness was not dying. So it was this experience of of seeing that I wasn't my body, that those seemed to be two different things. And it rendered the body actually oddly unimportant, which was another aspect of it. And so immediately upon recognizing that, there was this concurrent recognition that it wasn't that big of a deal even, which was very difficult to, otherwise conceptualize under normal circumstances. Another thing that was immediately clear was that even though my body was beginning to die, it was taking place at a relatively slow rate. I could literally feel that, as I said, life force, animating life force, just beginning to drain away. And it was sort of like imagining or watching the mercury in a thermometer just recede, and it was going rather slowly. I couldn't say exactly, but it kind of seemed like, there's probably at least a day or two that this could go on. So that sort of added to this feeling of, surprisingly, this feeling of not being terribly worried about it. Like there was plenty of time to consider this and to almost sort of revel in it. The other thing that was astonishing in that moment was that in recognizing that I wasn't my body, that also conferred a recognition that I wasn't the pain that was in that body. So this had really been, to that point, again, there had been 4 days in the hospital, there had been 3 or 4 days in my father's care, the farmhouse there, and that had been a level of just dealing with really mind-bending, like blackout level pain. And it was a level of pain that's actually quite typical for this kind of situation. So there wasn't anything surprising about it to anyone. It's just that I'd never experienced anything like that before. But in this moment, in recognizing that I wasn't the body, I also recognized that pain wasn't me. And it wasn't as though that in that moment, the pain itself disappeared. It's just that it was all of a sudden rendered kind of irrelevant. There was an immediate freedom from it in a way that was spectacularly freeing. It rendered it without real effect. Like the observing witness consciousness that was able to look upon the situation and recognize that the body wasn't me and that pain wasn't mine. That observing consciousness wasn't in pain at all. And being able to experience that, then again, it's kind of hard to put into words, of course, but because again, the pain itself didn't actually disappear. It was the first time I ever, and it was not the last, but it was the first time I ever got to experience the difference between pain and suffering. The pain was still there, but I wasn't not suffering it in any way at all. And of course, that was kind of a freedom from what had otherwise been really absolute hell up to this point. And in that moment of freedom, there sort of floods in this third recognition. So if the first was that I wasn't my body, and the second was that this process was going rather slowly, and that I had some time, the third was even harder to put into words than the other two, which was there was, as every iota of life force seemed to be falling away, there was an equal and growing experience of merging into the infinite. The overwhelming beauty of that rendered me into a state of absolute awe. One of the aspects of that that's more difficult to put into words than most is that there was no sense of loss in that. I could recognize that witness consciousness that was observing the body and didn't need to be concerned with the pain at all was still sort of there was a sort of sense of individuatedness in that. Like, okay, I wasn't my body, but I was some sort of non-corporeal consciousness, being that was still, sort of had a separate individuated sense to it. Like this non-corporeal but individuated sense could look at that body and see that it wasn't me. But in the merging into the infinite, it was clear that even that sense of individuatedness was beginning to dissipate. It was merging into the infinite. It was losing its individuality. It could easily be perceived by someone that's really a sense of what death is, when you lose your sense of self. If you are merging into the infinite, you are merging into what is absolutely whole, absolutely. It's like merging into this ineffable allness. And if something is completely whole and is all, and then there is nothing missing from it. Nothing missing from it. The word oneness is often thrown around in trying to describe these kinds of things. In any case, what I can say is that if something is completely whole, it can't possibly be missing anything. And that's why it's possible to experience the merging into the infinite and the loss of that sense of self as not having been a loss at all. Because how could there be any sense of loss in something that is utterly and completely whole? There can't possibly really be any sense of fear. Nothing's missing. There can't possibly be a sense that there is something broken or wrong. And so one of the funny outcomes of all of that is that I couldn't look upon my own dying body as being a problem. There was nothing wrong here. In fact, merging into that wholeness is something that was far and away the most beatific, most extraordinary, most staggeringly beautiful thing that I'd ever encountered. And so to think of it in terms of loss or being wrong or bad or a problem was absolutely impossible. And so I didn't. The only possible sort of default setting then was to experience it as, I'm borrowing this line from a popular source, but it was the peace that passes all understanding. But there was that sense of understanding that and reveling in that peace. And the only sort of natural default response to it was a quiet joy and a sense of awe. So that's it. I've discovered my body is dying. It's racked with mind-bending pain. And my response to it in the end is awestruck peace that passes understanding in a way that can only be expressed in quiet, absolute joy. And I basically sat and stared out the window in awe for some time. It's the middle of the day. My father has been sort of, coming in and out of the house periodically, doing farm chores and house chores and things and checking up on me periodically. And eventually he reappears and, has a look, how am I doing? I say nothing. I can't imagine how to explain any of this to him. I can barely talk at the moment as well. That's certainly a factor. Not only would I have found it extremely difficult to put into words at all, there was no impulse to put it into words. A phrase I've become very, very fond of was, it just seemed that silence was the best vessel for holding this. So I probably smiled at him and nodded when he asked if I was okay, and he went on with other things. And that's literally how I passed my afternoon. Certainly the thought of trying to explain to him that my body was dying and that I wasn't my body, I couldn't possibly explain that to him. And merging into the infinite was a whole other step beyond trying to explain that. It was just reveling in absolute peaceful bliss. And it went on like that, and on like that, and on like that. Eventually, evening comes, and throughout this past week, the simple act of going to sleep has been somewhere between extremely difficult and impossible, given those levels of pain and just the whole disruption of all things. But with this little change of affairs here, with this change of direction, with my body beginning to die, it was clearly apparent that I might actually be able to get some sleep all of a sudden. And the thought of resting that body in the sort of crucible of that peace just seemed very natural. So I did. I went to bed. I did actually sleep, and I woke up throughout the night. And every time I would sort of check in and think to myself, is this is this still happening? Is my body dying? The mercury is dropping a little lower. And every single time I asked that question internally, it was very clear. Yes, the body is dying. It's actually dying a little faster at this point. The mercury is dropping a little faster. Merging with the infinite is speeding up in accordance with that. It's as beatific and beautiful an experience as I can imagine. Eventually, I wake in the morning and just sort of begin my day in the same way that I'd left it the evening before. In a way, it's funny to recount that day because it could sound as though sitting around doing absolutely nothing but reveling in peace. One could even think that might even be boring, but it certainly didn't have that quality. There was still just an overwhelming sense of freedom in it. And again, my father sort of comes in and out during the day, and sometime in the probably early afternoon, he comes in, and I see the expression on his face changes, and he kind of squints his eyes up at me and looks carefully, and he says, Jonathan, I think something's not right. And I say nothing in return, even though I'm recognizing that he is beginning to recognize that maybe my body is, something is amiss with the body in his eyes. And I know he's right. I know that there's still time. Even into this next day, I've recognized that it's probably the day following that my body actually completes this death, that the merging into the infinite completes, that the body really does expire. So in to my way of thinking of it at that moment, there's still plenty of time. But it was also true that during that second day, there had been some thoughts of my own that arose that went something like, well, I can see the doorway here is wide open. And the actual act of dying could not possibly be easier or frankly, more joyful, beatific, essentially. It couldn't possibly be more gentle. And I have a clear choice as to whether I want to step through that doorway or not. In a way, I still can't really explain that. There was just a sort of sense in me growing that I thought, well, I think as beatific as this is and as extraordinarily natural as it would be to continue to go through that door, I think I might not do it. I think I might just choose to stay here for a while. I can't even quite explain why. There's just this feeling of like, yeah, I think I'm not quite done here. I'm not even sure what that means. What is it that I need to be doing here? I'm not even certain about that. But I think I might just not be done here yet. And it was sort of like a 51%, I'll stay, 49%, I'm delighted to go. And so when my father looks in my eyes and said, I think something's not right, Jonathan. And then he says, I think we better load up the car and head back to the hospital. And I think, all right, yeah, we can do that. Yeah, we can do that. I mean, we got plenty of time, I don't say any of this because I can still barely speak, but and I still can't figure out how to explain any of this to him. He has no idea really that I'm dying. But I nod my assent and say, all right, yeah, sure, why not? We'll go. And I'm not in a hurry, and I dawdle, and I don't know, at least a couple hours go by before we've actually got our act together. We're going to load up the car. It's a 2-hour drive back to the hospital. And we do this drive, and we, along the way, I've been in a fabulous mood for the last, 36 hours. Unlike the rest of the entire experience where it was just a complete hell. I can barely speak, but I'm literally trying to whisper out a joke or two just to see if I can get my dad to laugh, because I think the whole thing is hilarious. I think it's absurd. I think it's sort of charming and funny and sweet. And anyway, we get to the ER at the same hospital that the surgery had taken place in the first place. And upon admittance to the ER, it's immediately confirmed that my body is in fact dying. And it is dying for the dumbest reason on the planet, which is dehydration. And the fact is that having sometimes healthcare in America isn't all it's cracked up to be. Like why I was kicked out of the hospital in the first place in a state in which I was essentially incapable of eating or drinking is a little bit absurd. And it turns out that, I managed to consume maybe a couple of 100 calories over the previous week. And in terms of, as most of us know, in terms of calories, that's not that big of a deal. I lost 12 pounds immediately from an otherwise fit 20-something frame. But if you go without drinking for a week, you're in real trouble. And that's about where we were. So the docs shake their head like, this kid's dying from dehydration. That's absurd. So they hook me to an IV and immediately start a saline drip. And they probably empty a liter or two of saline into my body. And that's all they need to do. Immediately upon that IV being connected, I feel that life force immediately reverse. It starts to flow in instead of out. And it's immediately clear that merging with the infinite has also just begun to reverse. And so I'm coming back. This is the first instance in which my father begins to actually recognize that I was actually dying. He had no real awareness of it to that point. He's thrilled at this point because he's pretty sure he just saved me. I couldn't explain to him that there's more to the story than that. But he's very, he's really pleased. And it doesn't take too long. They keep me there for a few hours, and eventually I'm released and back in the car, and we're going to take another 2-hour drive back to the house that evening. And I do reflect quite a bit on the ride home, on that moment of thinking, no, I think I do want to be here. I think I got some things to do. I don't even know what they are, but I'm glad to be back. But wow, dying is absolutely extraordinary.